Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's talk on test optional admissions and test required admissions. I'm your host, Dr. Jed Appleruth, and excited to be here tonight. I hope to give you some good information about this world of admissions and what to do with your kids and trying to help them figure out a testing strategy. A little information, we're going to have this recorded and we're going to send you a copy of the recording. I see there's a chat feature. And also we're going to do in like about 30 seconds, when a few more folks come in, we do a little poll. Here it is. It's a tiny welcome poll. And all it is you click, are you a parent, student, educator? If you are, what grade is your kiddo in? Boom. And that's all. We are done with that poll. That was easy. And we'll do one tiny one at the end. So again, we're going to have a Q&A at the end. There'll be time. I hope to answer a lot of your questions between now and the Q&A session. I have a pretty thorough deck, and I hope to give you good stuff. So without further ado, let's jump right in and talk about test optional and test required admissions. All right. So we have 4 options that schools can choose from when they're trying to figure out their strategy toward assessments. We're going to require them, got to have them. They're optional. Send them if you want to. Flexible, you can under certain circumstances, or you can send different tests. And then test blind, we don't want them. We don't want to see them. So those are the four policies. Now, the biggest by far is test optional. The world we live in is now a test optional world by and large. There are 1,900 plus schools in the country of the 2,500 four-year schools that require that are now test optional. So it doesn't mean that test scores don't matter, but it means you don't have to submit. And we'll talk more about that. So, because again, there are many things in life that are optional when applying to your college. Taking advanced classes, optional, not required, but still impactful. Having 4s and 5s on your APs, optional, but impactful. Showing a college interest, optional. And then also showing some leadership in your activities, optional. But all of these things can make a difference when you apply. So when you hear the word, oh, it's test optional, just know that there are a lot of things which make a difference, which are optional. All right. The majority of colleges out there in the country have not taken a fixed firm position. They're still waiting for more data. Most colleges went test optional in 2020, 2021 in that cycle during the pandemic. And so a lot of them, they still don't have 4 years of data for a full set of kids who didn't have test scores. And they're trying to figure out, does it make a difference? Do some kids who come in test optional do as well, not as well? Do they do better before they make a firm decision? And some schools, as they're getting to 3 years of data, are starting to make decisions. We've heard some of them in the last 6 months coming out and saying, many of them saying, we actually want tests back because they have enough data to realize the tests do in fact matter for our university. All right, so optional, that's the first one. What does it mean? So if you submit an application without testing, it's going to be read as a complete application. Totally fine. But again, you know, when one piece is missing, other things get more weight. It's very natural. And if you do send test scores, it's part of the process of the review process, but you don't have to have it. Kids are getting into schools that are test optional all the time, and often it's a large part of the class, though that varies. As colleges are more selective, typically more of the class that's enrolled are students who have test scores. That's pretty standard for many schools that are highly selective. There are things that colleges get, and many are loath to give up when they go test optional. More kids apply as well. I have a few slides on that. The perception of you're more selective. You can also admit lower scoring kids without hurting your profile of your incoming freshman class. And typically, the bottom quarter of students or so, the bottom third, do not send test scores. So the kids who do, your average test scoring goes up. So you have higher average test scores. You will get more applications. For some schools, that's very appealing. Here are a few colleges I picked. I could have picked 100 schools where after they went test optional, their application numbers really increased. NYU, UCLA, Duke, Colgate, and some of these colleges are, Duke announced recently they're going to stay test optional. I think they really like having these extra 15,000 applications. And Colgate also, their numbers went, more than doubled. So that's very, very profound. Now, then we have this other policy. There's optional. Know what that means. Test required. Very simple. If you do not have a test score, you cannot apply. That's very clear, and that's the way well over 1,000 plus schools. The top schools in the country were all test required before 2020, with a couple exceptions like Chicago. But that was normal, and now it's coming back with a trickle, little by little. And also, many kids, you self-report your test scores when you apply, and then if you are accepted, then you're going to spend the money for an official test score. But they let you on the Common App say, I got a 33, I got a 1500, I got a 1180, whatever it is, you send it. And then if you are accepted, you send your actual official scores. So here we have the calendar that after COVID, we began seeing the slow trickle, and I guarantee there are many, many, many more coming. But it was really moving last in the winter into the spring. University of Georgia system, they brought back testing within a year of the pandemic. Then Georgetown, they were within a year. MIT came back, Tennessee, Purdue. Then we had in the last 6 months, Dartmouth and Yale, then Brown and Texas, then Harvard and Caltech, and Cornell and Stanford. And I guarantee that with early fall or after the next cycle of admissions, we're going to have many more schools coming on board. Questions are which ones, and we don't know, but most likely looking at this list, we're going to see more private schools, and we're going to see more highly selective schools and state schools. So that is coming. And that's interesting because if you're a sophomore, you're looking at schools, you're not sure yet which schools are going to be test required. And one of your schools in your list might jump in 4 months. So that is something to be mindful of as you're building your testing plan. Okay. And here are just some examples of the big schools that are selective. I'm going to add to that list. Now, the rationale. Why are they doing this? MIT, they've been required for a couple of years that we can't tell who will do well at our college without test scores, because there are too many kids who have good grades who come to MIT and do not do well. So the test scores were a means of protecting kids so they wouldn't fail out of MIT and have a failure experience. Over at Brown, that test scores are a better predictor of performance of our kids than high school grades. Again, there's been a lot of grade inflation in the past 20, 30 years, and it's affecting things. Over at Yale, test scores are the single best predictor of performance at Yale. And then high school GPA explains a lot less than testing. That's Dartmouth. Test emitters had higher GPAs after controlling for high school grades and class rank at UT at Texas. So that's one of the reasons. It's not an accident. It's because test scores actually give something unique and independent of high school grades, and colleges want it. There is a researcher, Raj Chetty, over at Harvard. He's a future Nobel laureate, brilliant fella, looking at over 2 million applications, tremendous data set. He's a big data guy. And they revealed that, again, high school grades are a weaker predictor than test scores at the Ivies +4 and the +4 MIT, Duke, Chicago, and Stanford. Here is the research. It's very clear. As test scores go up, grades in college go up in a straight line. But as high school GPA goes up, grades only slowly move. So there's not much of a difference. It's like 0.1, the difference in GPA at college for someone with a 3.1 versus a 4.0 is only about, 1/10 of a point of GPA. So high school grades, everyone's getting a lot of high grades, and they aren't so predictive compared to testing. That's a pretty important slide there. That's why we're seeing this change. And again, it's testing as a hedge against grade inflation. Having A's is not that special anymore. There are a lot of kids with a lot of high grades. And the whole thing is what kind of A's and what kind of classes. Just having a 4.0. Like I gave a talk last month with a admissions officer from Georgia Tech, and out of state, 74% of kids who get into tech have 4.0 unweighted. Not a single B in the transcript, but 3/4 of students getting into tech don't have a single B in high school. That's amazing. And from Georgia, it's 54%. So having all A's, that's half of the kids in state and 3/4 out of state. That's not a special grand scheme. So testing is an important piece of it. At Texas, again, the kids who did not have test scores were 55% more likely to be on probation academically at mid-year. And at the end of the year, they were 0.86 grade points behind kids with test scores. So test scores, again, were protective for the very selective school. And UT admits a lot of kids, auto admits from in-state, but this is mostly out-of-state kids and kids not getting in automatically from like the top 6% of high school kids in Texas. Now, testing is returning to a number of publics. Florida never dropped test scores. Tennessee came back in 2022. Georgia, there's now a test required. There's a year left before Georgia State and Kennesaw, Georgia Southern are required again. But Tech and UGA, the flagship schools, they've been required now for several years. And Texas, the flagship state school, UT Austin, is now test required. And this list is going to grow, guarantee that. All right, so we have there is a sense that we're going to see a lot more state schools coming, especially state schools from the South. I'm waiting every week until UNC Chapel Hill says a test required. The regents, they gave the go-ahead green light that any one of the UNC system schools can reinstate testing. And Carolina, Chapel Hill, they currently admit it's 6% of students out of state. So they're more selective than Texas for out-of-state kids. And with that, I think they're going to, eventually go back and require testing. We might see Virginia, we might see South Carolina, Alabama, all the southern state schools may reinstate. I'm waiting for, Auburn, maybe Alabama. But we're going to see this map fill in over time, I believe, and other schools as well. Now, then we have test flexible. And you can opt out of testing if you have a certain GPA or threshold, or you have an option to submit other things like AP exams. Auburn has a test flexible / conditional approach and their language is clear. They've actually changed the language this year. Auburn is a test preferred institution. We recommend it, however, and then we encourage it, but it's not required. As long as you have a 3.6 or above. And their language is interesting. You have at least a 3.6, and you cannot secure a test. So that's interesting. Most kids these days can secure a test. And so I recommend, if you're applying to Auburn, that you do submit test scores, even if you have over a 3.6, but again, it's not required. If you have a 3.59 or below, you must submit testing. That's how it's test flexible or test conditional. Then you have Yale. They require testing, but they are now flexible in their policy that either you submit an SAT or an ACT. If you cannot access those, then you can submit every one of your AP scores or every one of your IB scores. And they mentioned on a podcast, Jeremiah Quinlan, the head of admissions, he said, one of the reasons we're doing this is because we know that there are kids from California who are having a hard time getting testing access. So that's one of the reasons why they increased the range of options to include APs and IBs, but again, it's all of them. If you have a 3, it's going to. Can't hide that. And other places, if you aren't sending test scores, like the SAT or the ACT, then other things you have will carry more weight. Like if you have, AP exams, they actually can be weighted higher in lieu of absent an SAT or ACT score, because that is still a standardized measure to help them ground your GPA. Because there are 30,000 high schools in the US, the publics, and there are many different grading cultures. Getting what a 93 means at this high school means something very different than one down the street or across their different state. So not all grades are given for mastery, and how you define mastery is very different. Cornell, when they were optional, now they're test required, they clarified that not testing will increase scrutiny on other things. If you don't have testing, we look more closely at academic rigor and GPA, at other testing like APs, at your essays, teacher, counselor X, which makes total sense. If one piece of this, one leg of the stool is missing, the other ones will take more weight. It's very natural. Now, there are a small number of schools in the country that to them testing is meaningless. They are test blind in every sense. And now there are about 70 colleges, about 34 are UC and Cal State. Many of them are California, they're test blind or test free, score free. And then 17 are piloting those for the coming school year, but they haven't made a full move. So that's only 84 colleges, which is 3% of the total, but it's still a meaningful number, especially if you're looking at the UCs or Cal State, Fullerton, things like that. Other schools, a lot of them are smaller, like St. Mary's, Northern Illinois, Worcester Poly is one of the stronger STEM schools on the list. LaSalle, Pitzer. There used to be 2 others, Caltech, they were blind, and Cornell. also had 3 of the schools in Cornell were test blind. And now they've gone test blind to test required. So that can happen after they get their data back. So it's important you realize that test optional, test blind are very different things. And schools that are optional, testing can still be important. And in some cases, very important to impacting your chances of admission. We know that one factor that comes into play is if you don't send test scores in certain schools, even those who are optional, it can affect your merit-based aid. We know that Alabama, they're test optional, but they offer fairly generous scholarships for kids who are applying with decent GPAs and good testing. The tuition this year at Alabama, it's going to be $33,000. If you have a 1420 SAT or a 32 ACT, they're going to knock your tuition debt from $33,000 down to $5,000. That's very meaningful. That's an award of $112,000. So that can move the needle. And there are other schools in the South, other schools across the country who offer merit-based aid, not need-based aid. There's totally merit-based aid for good grades and good scores. Utah State, Texas Tech, Lake Forest. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. We have something called the Zell Miller Scholarship, and tuition at the Georgia colleges and system, it's free. You have free tuition if you have a 3.7 GPA and either a 26 or a 1200 on the SAT. All right, so testing. You have a test score. The question is, do I send it or not to a school that's optional? Be careful of sending a weak score. It's not going to help, and it most likely will hurt. Strong scores can be a sign of strength. And if there are other holes, testing can round things out, showing your chops in math or in verbal, and it can show you're ready for college level work. And of course, it can affect merit-based aid and placement. Now, there are different rates of test submission. It used to be in the upper 70s before COVID, but now that's decreased to 45%. But that's across all the colleges. That's the Common App data from over 1 million kids applying. Submissions have not dropped so precipitously at schools that are selective, because there are many schools in the country that are not selective. So that average is capturing all of that. Additionally, we know that more kids are applying with strategy, before the pandemic, only 4 out of 100 kids sent test scores to some, but not all of their schools. But in 2020, that number increased to 24% of students. And now we don't have current data, but I'm imagining that more than half of the kids send test scores to some schools, but not all schools, because they know this same exact score, this 29 ACT, helps me here and hurts me here. And that's part of the calculus to send, not send in its individual based on every single school you're applying to. We know that there are different rates of submission based on major. That Jeff Selingo, author, researcher in education, found that for one national school, research school, I don't know if it was, UNC or Virginia or Georgia, one of those, but he said 3/4 of kids applying to engineering to the school sent test scores, about half to business, about a third to education and social work or general ed. And so again, STEM kids often want to showcase their math skills, and that's why they include testing. Now, parents want to find out, does it make a difference if I have scores or not? It's optional. Is it really, how optional is it? Well, at certain schools who've shared data, and there aren't that many of them, the difference is quite profound. At Yale, kids with testing got in at a 3-to-1 rate. Boston College, it's almost 3-to-1. Tech, now it's required, but was more than double. Colgate, more than double. Notre Dame, double. Emory, about double. UVA, about double. So there are many schools, and we don't have data on hundreds and hundreds of schools. So this is a small set of data we got from press releases. They don't publish this. It's not captured in the common data set. It's just for a year or two, they happen to announce or give a press release with information that help us. Some of these things, we had to piece together 3 bits of data to get these numbers. So this is not commonly shared data. And part of it, they want every kid to apply. Even Yale, they were not forthright. They were saying we are full-throated, test optional. Send scores or don't, we are open to both. But then on their admissions process, they were admitting kids with testing at 3 times the rate. So that is something which is a bit disingenuous. And then there are schools, we don't have data on every school in the country, but we do have data that's captured called the Common Data Set. And all you have to do is CDS, type in Common Data Set for Princeton 2023, Common Data Set for any school in the country, and they're required by federal law to actually publish a Common Data Set. And so, I think it's federal law. because there is some impetus where they have to release, it has information about student acceptance rates, about student diversity rates. All these things are captured in the common data set. And part of it is how many kids submit test scores. And so Princeton, they are test optional. However, 85 out of 100 kids who are accepted have a test score. At UNC, it's 81%, UVA, 7%, Chicago, 76, Penn, Emory. So you see that these schools are optional, but who's getting in? Typically kids with test scores, and that tells you something about their admissions department. Even though on their marketing it says we are optional, I would read this data very carefully. Jeremiah Quinlan, he was very transparent after they made their change, and they said, we are admitting kids at 3 times the rate. And as we got through the cycle, I became more concerned that we were not being honest about the reality of our admissions department. We were denying 98 out of 100 kids who had no test scores. And kids who didn't submit test scores were hurting their chances at Yale. So again, this is not published, but this was what's happening behind the curtain. So that's something which gives you pause for schools who are very selective, who are test optional. I would be inclined to submit test scores to very selective schools, unless they're very clear that we don't want your score. I have a niece who applied to Tulane. She had a 1390 on the SAT. A Tulane rep visited her school in Richmond and said, we don't want any scores below a 1420. And she heard that and listened and didn't send it and got in with her 13. She didn't send test scores there. She sent test scores to South Carolina and Georgia. Other places got in there, but did not send test scores to Tulane and was accepted. So if they tell you we don't want scores below this threshold, don't send them, listen to them. But that's very rare. Boston College, they were full-throated test optional for 3 years, but their numbers were very telling. You had 17,000 kids apply with tests, 23,000 applied without tests. Who got in? 5,000 with tests, 2,500 without tests. So the admission rate, again, it's dramatically different for kids with and without test scores. So they finally updated their guidance this year after 3 years of this policy. At BC, internal research has shown that test scores, they add measurable value to predict success at our school. For this reason, students who complete the test are encouraged to submit their scores. Similarly, Grinnell, they are optional, but the language is telling on their testing page. If you get the score you hope for, it's above average, then submitting it may help you. A high test score can offset a low GPA. If you don't submit a test score, we have less information about you or your performance. So again, they're giving little hints. They're teasing. They're not test required, but they're saying like, we'd like to have it. Test encouraged. And there are many schools who, read their language, listen to their talk when they come to your school. I heard something very similar. One of my colleagues attended a session with a rep from the University of Southern California, who they said, for all intents and purposes, we want your test scores, and we expect test scores, even though they're test optional. So again, the admissions officers are running around saying different things than what's published on their website. Test scores really matter. But again, this is for schools that are very selective, not all schools in the country. So the choice is, do I send my scores? Now, before you do a darn thing, and get your baseline testing in and figure out, am I better first on the SAT or the ACT? And then am I close enough to hit a target score that will be competitive to actually prep and plan and do the work? Because it may be you're looking at 7 schools and the average, test accepted, the average, incoming freshman class has like a 33 on the ACT. And in your first pass, you get a 21 on the ACT. So you're 11 points behind, 12 points behind. In that case, I say that is such a massive, enormous leap that I would not put energy and resources in testing. If, however, I get a 27, 28, and I'm shooting for a 32, yeah, I would say prep, I would say test. You're close enough to get something that's going to be competitive or compelling for the school, in which case it's worth your time and energy and resources. All right. And so then, when you send it, are they going to add value? Are they going to strengthen the application or diminish it? So STEM and business tests may in fact matter more because kids who are applying to STEM programs, engineering, business programs, they seem to be getting in at higher rates with their test scores. Sean Felton, colleague from Cornell, said certain majors, listen, fine arts, classical music, that's not going to be as compelling. But if you're applying again to be an accounting major You're going to be applying to, some other major matters a lot more. Like fine arts, it's going to be your portfolio, classical music, your audition. But a lot of majors, yeah, your math and your scores matter. And now Cornell is required again for all schools. Rick Clark, colleague, friend, great speaker, author, talks about if you're in the top half, always send it. If you're in the lower half, it depends. But if you're in the bottom quartile, I probably wouldn't send it. So he was saying it's that third quartile, it really depends based on other factors. How good are your grades, the academic rigor, is testing. Are you close to that halfway mark or closer to the bottom quarter mark, and so forth. And so your grades do matter. If my grades are amazing, I have a 4.0, unweighted, all A's in rigorous classes, and my testing is relatively weak, then I probably would not send. However, like if my, grades are relatively lower, my testing is stronger, I probably send it. So the whole thing is looking at the balance of your grades and your scores and seeing how that lines up. And individual section score matters. Well, let's say I have a 1400. I'm applying to a school where they want a 1480. That's the average for the high school, for the freshman class. But I'm applying to an engineering program and I have an 800 math and a 600 on verbal. In that case, I would definitely send the score. Even though my composite is below their average, that math score is really important to showcase my chops as an engineer. Therefore, I will send it even though it's below profile and the composite, because I'm actually at or above profile with math. Be careful, be mindful. We talked to a admissions officer at a very selective school in the Northeast. He said, you cannot ever unsee a weak score. Someone sends me a 1 or 2 on an AP. They send me, they have good grades, good rigor. They have a 4.0 in calculus, BC Calc. Then they have a 1 on the exam. And suddenly that 1 calls into question that 95 in the class. All of my great, my 3.9 unweighted GPA, then someone sends me a 22 ACT. It's like, oh man, what do I make of the school, the teachers, the grading policy? So you never, ever, ever want to send a weak score. Only send something with strength. And same thing with AP exams. You wouldn't want to send a 1 or 2 under any circumstance. That's not a passing score. Unless, you have to, you're applying to Yale or something and you have to send it. Only send things that strengthen. And then, of course, treat every school differently. You don't want to treat them all the same. Be strategic in your submission. Because again, the same exact score, like my niece had a 1390 that helped her at Georgia. She got in. Helped her at Alabama. She got in. Helped her at South Carolina. She got in. She withheld that score from Virginia because it was below profile. She withheld that score from Tulane because they told her don't send it. And so, you treat every school distinctly. Here's an example of submitting, not submitting, like Swarthmore. Their middle 50 range, this actually is a couple years dated, but should be close, was a 680 to 750. That's, the middle 50. For verbal and for math, it's 790. So that means their composite middle 50 percentile is a 1380 to a 1540. So I go and test and I get a score. Do I send it? Well, if I get over a 1470, send it, send it, send it. Don't hold it back, off it goes. If I get below a 1380, unless there's something extremely extenuating, you are a student from a very low income school, and your 1360 is the very top of the class or best in 2 years, or you're applying from a region where very few kids, you're applying from West Virginia or Wyoming or, Southern Idaho, there's a place where they don't get many kids applying, and, they want kids from West Virginia, then your 1360 may be compelling. So you have to look at the context of your application. Look, are you a first generation student and no one in your parent, you're the first one going to college? Well, then that test score could be beneficial to you. If both my parents are college educated, I'm at a strong public, a feeder school, or a strong private school, and I'm well below the average for my high school, then that 1360 probably won't help me. And so that's being mindful of that. If you're in that third quartile, that's what Rick Clark says, it depends. Because again, am I closer to the 1460 or closer to 1380? And also, are my grades are amazing. I probably want to be evaluated on the merits of my grades alone and not on my testing. Or are my grades, I have a 3.5, but I have like a 1420, I would send it. Or if I'm a 1390, but there is a 780 in math in there, and I'm an aspiring engineer, then I would send it to make sure they saw that I'm great at math, which is what matters for my intended major. That's kind of, and again, every school, you have to do this calculus. It's not a simple and easy send, don't send. It's look at every school, look at the numbers, look at the major, and then make a decision. So it takes a little time, maybe an hour every time to do the research, but it's worth it. It's important to evaluate each one individually. It is important to note that on average, the tests, the middle 50 percentile has increased at many schools. And this is for enrolled kids. It didn't move so much at Yale because they admitted that, going test optional didn't change who we admitted, which is why they're going back to test required. They said they got 15,000 or so new applicants once they were optional, but most of the applicants, they were either international kids who were so happy about not having to do the test, or they were kids domestically in the US who were below Yale's profile. So they kept admitting the same kids, which tells you that's why they're going back to testing. Other schools, they lopped off the bottom quarter of kids who had bad test scores. And so, and when you lop off the bottom quarter, test scores tend to pop a little bit. At some schools, they popped a lot. Vermont, up 100 points. Davidson, up 50 points. Colgate, up over 100 points from the bottom. So again, we're seeing that increase. And for that reason, be mindful that I might look back to the common data set from 2020 just to see where the average test scores were back then. Because it could be that you have a test score that would have been compelling and selective and a qualifying score in 2020, but because they lopped off the bottom quarter, the things moved up. And Brown said, hey, our middle test scores have increased because, and they're actually inflated. And so look back and look back a little bit and see if my score would have been competitive 3 years ago, I still would consider sending it, even if it's below profile a little bit right now, because things have changed a little bit. Now, when it comes to making your testing plan, I asked ChatGPT to build me an image, and it did. I always love these new computer-generated images. Now, the ACT, as you probably have heard, if you get our newsletters, which I hope you do, if not, then sign up for them. There is a shorter science optional ACT coming in April and coming in digitally and in paper form in September. Now, until we know more, I don't know how widely available these tests are going to be. And we also, can't prep kids on these. There was a pilot in June, but there's no testing material out there. So right now, this is still in the abstract, and I wouldn't focus too much on this right now until we know more and know will this be widely available to students. But right now, we do know we have the SAT, we have the ACT, and you want to take one of each and get a dual baseline or use the PSAT and then make a decision. And so before you do a darn thing, get one of each underway. Now on the SAT scale, there's about 30 points of error on the SAT and 30 points on the ACT. So the total combined selected error of measurement is about 60 points. So if I get above that, let's say I get a 26 on the ACT, but I get a 1290 SAT, well, I'm stronger. I'm beyond the margin of error. And so in that case, I would just go full strength toward the SAT. A lot of kids are in that range of indifference. They may have a 26 ACT, but they'll have an 1180 SAT or a 1230, and they're in the margin of error, range of indifference. In that case, go with your preference. But if you're beyond that range of indifference, go with your stronger test. Very important. When you're building your testing plan, ideally plan on taking it 3 times. We have a lot of kids who are 1 and done, some are 2 and done, but our data shows that kids typically see gains through the 3rd test. And so have 3 in your testing plan, whether you need them or not. Things that make a difference over the course of your testing year, practice tests. You have to do practice tests under controlled conditions, period. You have to spread things out. Don't try to cram it in a week. Ideally, you have 6 weeks, 8 weeks, or 10 weeks. My ideal is 10 weeks to really spread it out, do a little work every week, and have time to learn, forget, relearn. When you put in more time, you tend to do better. Kids who start earlier tend to do better. And you want to have momentum going into the last your test. If you're taking a test in March, make sure you do at least 1 practice test in February. Makes sense. Also, have a goal. It's important that students are working towards a score, and ideally you have a specific measurable goal. If I have a 28 on the baseline, I'm going for a 32. So with every test, every practice I'm going for, I'm seeing, am I tracking, trending making progress towards my stated goal. We have 7 ACTs over the calendar year and 7 SATs. April, we should hopefully see the first digital shorter ACT with science as an option. But there are testing options throughout the entire year. And that is the end of my deck. Peter, why don't we just launch the poll, the follow-up poll now. It's going to be a couple questions, short and sweet and simple. And then we're going to go into the Q&A. Are you interested in any kind of support from Apple Ruth? If you want us to reach out to you or not. And then there we go. That takes all 10 seconds. And then if you want any help, and we do test prep, we do tutoring and executive functioning coaching. Okay. Now, I want to open things up to some Q&A. So there's a Q&A window. If y'all would take a minute and anything I haven't yet answered, type it in the Q&A field and I'll answer it. And there may not be many questions. I may have answered a bunch. I'll give you another 15 or 20 seconds or so. And if there are questions you want to ask in person, just call our informational line. We're happy to talk to you. When should tests start? I like doing testing during when sophomore year is over. Ideally, sophomore year wraps up and you're good to go. The summer before you're a junior, totally fine. Anytime junior year, totally fine. I also like wrapping up testing ideally by the summer before your senior year. So you can focus on your applications and so forth the fall of senior year. Because most kids are going to be applying somewhere early action, early decision. And those deadlines are often October, November 1st. And so I want testing completed by the September ACT or the August SAT. And some schools will accept an October test date for early admissions, but not all of them will. And you can look on their website to find out that their testing policies of when they'll accept things or inquire with the admissions office. So I think you want to start testing about 8 to 10 weeks before your first official test. Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, I think we've answered them all. Again, you'll be getting a copy of this deck in a couple days. And if you have any other questions, please reach out. We're happy to help you with anything with testing, with getting higher grades, or executive functioning coaching, which is my favorite thing to do. And everyone, thanks for being out here tonight. I hope you learned something. And feel free to share the link with anyone who might benefit from this. All right, y'all. Have a good night.